Welcome to today's American Community Media briefing, co-sponsored by California Common Cause, a valued partner since the early days of our predecessor, New California Media. I'm Sandy Close, ACOM Director, and your moderator for today. Our topic is about California's unprecedented special election on November 4th. New congressional districts are on the ballot, as well as the balance of power in Congress. This election is all about representation. President Trump ignited a mid-decade redistricting battle demanding new congressional maps in Texas to favor the Republican Party ahead of next year's midterms. Now, California is attempting to counterbalance this move through new maps proposed in the upcoming special election. Nonpartisan voting rights experts from Common Cause will detail what this special election means for California, the key information voters need to know, and how voters can find nonpartisan help making their voices heard at the polls. We welcome our panel, which includes Darius Kemp, Executive Director, California Common Cause; Brittany Stonecipher, Voting Rights and Redistricting Senior Program Manager, California Common Cause; and Dan Vicuña, Senior Policy Director for Voting and Fair Representation, Common Cause. We ask speakers to speak slowly as I'm speaking. For our simultaneous interpreters in Korean, Mandarin, and Spanish, we ask reporters to enter questions in the chat, letting us know your name and outlet. We will take questions after each speaker and again during the last 10 minutes of the briefing or as time allows. We urge our speakers to monitor and respond to questions in the chat. We begin with Darius Kemp, who will talk about the role Common Cause has played in redistricting reform in California and its ongoing commitment to promoting fair representation in the state. Welcome, Mr. Kemp. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sandy. I'm so happy to work with you and thank you for your partnership throughout the years. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Darius Kemp. I am the new Executive Director for California Common Cause. Common Cause is the People's Lobby, a nonpartisan democracy reform and voting rights organization that has members in every congressional district in the nation. We're here today to discuss the November 4th special election, which is all about redistricting and representation. We care deeply about this because we know that redistricting is more than just lines on a map. Fair maps mean fair representation, fair votes, and a fair future for everyone. As an organization, we have fought for fair maps all the way to the Supreme Court and brought an independent redistricting commission to California, which is the gold standard for redistricting across the nation. California Common Cause has been leading the way for decades to make sure that our state's redistricting processes are transparent and representative. Like I just mentioned, in 2008, we helped end partisan gerrymandering in the state of California's on their legislative lines. And in 2010, we did the same for congressional lines here in the state of California by establishing the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. The California Citizens Commission ensures voters, not politicians, come first. Because democracy matters at all levels of government, we have successfully enacted similar reforms for fair, impartial, and representative redistricting at the local level as well. Most recently, passing Measures DD and LL in Los Angeles, establishing an independent commission for the city and the LA Unified School Districts. During the 2020 local redistricting cycle, we developed resources to educate community groups, local jurisdictions, and members of the public about the processes. We watchdogged redistricting in over 60 cities, counties, and school boards. Our work focused on empowering communities to make their voices heard, which led to more public involvement in fairer and more equitable redistricting processes at both the local and the state level throughout California. We recognize that we're at an extraordinary moment in our democracy, and everything is unfolding at lightning speeds. Today, my colleagues, Dan and Brittany, will discuss how we got here, what this special election means for Californians, and the key information that voters need to know. So thank you all for being here and happy to answer any initial questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Kemp. I want to take a quick look at some of the questions in the chat. And I see that Mr. Fantini with Hispanic LA, can you start off our questions?
Yes, thank you, Sandy. My question is looking at the big picture. Of course, I mean, here we have this Proposition 50 that obviously it's going to be very important in terms of what's going to happen in Congress. But on the other hand, I mean, looking at the big picture and talking about the Voting Rights Act, I mean, why is the Supreme Court's upcoming decision in Louisiana versus Calais so important for making sure everyone's vote counts fairly? And how could it affect minority communities' ability to choose leaders who represent them under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and I'm going to actually let our senior director, Dan, who is works with our national partners. He's on our national team, and Dan has a lot, and also works with our litigation team as well. And so I think Dan will have a lot of insight here.
Dan, do you
Yeah,
why don't you address that question now, even if it's also part of what you'll be presenting?
sure, happy to. So for decades, the Voting Rights Act has been um, a key pillar of America's effort to ensure racial justice and racial equity and equal access to the ballot for all people in the United States. And a specific area of that, about 40 years ago or so, the U.S. Supreme Court interpreted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to require, under certain circumstances, the drawing of legislative districts that would allow people of color, communities of color, to elect their preferred candidates, right? If you had a community that was large enough to make up a majority of a kind of normally shaped district, that community voted largely the same way, that the white majority tended to vote against their preferred candidate, it created circumstances in which a map-making body was required to draw a district that would allow that community to elect their preferred candidates, and it's made significant strides toward ensuring that communities across the country could actually have representation in the halls of power. Now, just yesterday, the U.S. Supreme Court heard a case, Louisiana v. Calais, that seeks to undermine that important protection that's empowered communities of color for so long. It seeks a decision from the Supreme Court that would eliminate any use of race in the drawing of districts, and you could see a complete wipeout of Black, Latino, Asian representation in Congress and state legislatures, city councils, it would make a huge difference. It would be absolutely devastating. And you saw some of the conservative justices suggest that it was time to eliminate those important protections from a Voting Rights Act that they have already gutted over the last 15 years. So, usually those decisions come out at near the end of the term in June, maybe kind of even the end of June for the most controversial, difficult ones. So we'll wait and see how it goes, but it's a big threat to Voting Rights Act protections.
And maybe when you are our second speaker, Mr. Vicuña, you could talk about how important that decision will be compared to what California decides to do with the special election redrawing of maps now being proposed.
Okay.
Okay, let's go to a second question. Araceli Martinez with La Opinion. Do you want to ask your question?
Hello, Sandy, and I'm happy to see you. And
Thank you.
thank you for the opportunity. I was wondering if you have some polling that show us about what can we expect for the election on November 4. Do you think that this proposition will pass?
So,
Mr. Kemp.
yeah, just so you know, we're a nonpartisan organization, so we're not currently doing or normally do any polling on, issues like this in this way. Our goal is to make sure that voters have all the fair and balanced information they need in order to make an informed decision. I will say, though, we have done polling. Specifically, we polled over 2,000 Americans, 500 of which here in the state of California, and also 500 in the state of Texas, and other states as well, that ask voters about the importance of redistricting. And what I can say is that this issue around mid-decade redistricting that started with Trump asking Texas to find more votes. That led to Governor Gavin Newsom presenting Prop 50 in quick succession. I can say that our polling shows that Californians as well as a majority of Americans see the importance of redistricting. They believe that voters should pick their elected officials and not elected officials picking their voters. Even a majority of Republicans in California believe that redistricting is important for our democracy, not to mention a majority of Democrats and a majority of independents. So it's very clear that polling, I cannot say we do not have any polling, and I cannot say how people are feeling about Prop 50 in terms of its likelihood of passing or not passing. But what I can say is that people are very much understand the importance of redistricting and understand that redistricting is something that is a core factor of determining if we have a fair and free and open and a representative democracy. I'm also going to kind of open it up to either Brittany or Dan that might have any additional comments here on this.
About the polling, because several questions are asking about the polls, and I would just say the Institute for Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley, I believe, has done the most recent poll on this, but I may be wrong. Brittany, do you have any sense of what the polling in California is to this point on November 4th ballot?
I would just defer to Darius's comment and if Dan has anything else to add.
No, I haven't. I don't know what the polling is on. Sorry.
Okay, great. So do connect to the Institute for Governmental Studies polling, Mark DiCamillo. We have more questions in the chat, and I just want to make sure to address them. Elena Kutsanova, you're asking, do you want to ask your question of Mr. Kemp?
Yes, thank you, Sandy, so much. My question is about if other states are going to repeat California's practice and hold a special election, or at least they are doing something in this direction, or California just alone in this field. Thank you.
I'm gonna thank. I'm sorry, Sandy.
Yeah, you're gonna
I'm gonna make sure Dan has some. I know Dan. Once again, Dan works on our national team and has a lot of insight into kind of other states here. So I'm gonna let Dan kind of step in here.
great.
Yeah. So
Well,
we're seeing. Sorry, Sandy. Go ahead.
no, you can go right ahead. I know
Okay.
we're kind of jumping a little ahead, but please bear with
Yeah,
us
it's okay.
because there's so much interest in this topic, and we're more informal than we are otherwise.
Yeah, so just on kind of both sides of the ledger, right? Both partisan sides of the ledger, you're seeing a few states that are, in addition to Texas, um, uh, either moving forward with a mid-decade redraw following the president's orders to gerrymander their states on the Republican side. So you've already seen the state of Missouri pass a map, and with the purpose of dismantling a representation in Kansas City, Missouri, where a black elected leader, Representative Cleaver, the preferred choice of the communities of color in Kansas City, he's specifically being targeted to eliminate one Democratic seat there. You are seeing there's pushback though. Missouri has an option for a people's veto where you can collect signatures and reverse that move, and we're supporting that effort to help them out in doing that. Right next door in the state of Kansas, there's an effort to target their Democratic representative, Sharice Davids, Native American representative, also in Kansas City, Kansas area. Florida's considering this, again, looking at dismantling majority minority districts, coalition districts, to create more Republican seats. Um, and Indiana, the vice president has made a heavy effort to go by showing up there as well to pressure legislators to do a redraw. Same thing, they would probably look at dismantling districts that in which some communities of color are concentrated. If you're noticing a pattern, starting with Texas and their attack on coalition districts for communities of color. That is the through line through all of this. Attacks on the ability of communities of color to make their voices heard on election day.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, thank you. We're going to move now to your formal presentation, Mr. Vicuña. Thank you for accommodating the questions. We have a number of questions that I'm going to hold until after your presentation and Ms. Stonecipher's presentation. So please, and don't worry about being repetitive because it takes me a while to absorb the points you're making. So I'm always happy to have stuff repeated.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I'll just start with, again, some of the logistics briefly. California's going to have a statewide special election. That's on November 4th, 2025, this year. Across the state, voters are going to be asked to decide Proposition 50, a measure that would redraw California's congressional districts ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. Prop 50 is going to be the only statewide measure on the November 4th ballot. You're going to have some local measures that might also be on the ballot in your city or county. Voters can find more information about that on our website, commoncause.org/voteca. As mentioned earlier, Prop 50 would adopt a new U.S. House map for California. It's going to be used in the elections from 2026 until 2030. If voters approve Prop 50 on November 4th, the map specified in AB 604 would take effect for California's U.S. House districts starting in 2026. After the 2030 census, redistricting authority will return back to the Citizens Redistricting Commission under existing law. So Prop 50, if passed, would affect only U.S. House districts, so it wouldn't touch state assembly or state senate districts. to be time limited. The Prop 50 map is going to end after the 2030 census, and after 2030, the power to draw districts will return to the Citizens Redistricting Commission. So where did Prop 50 come from? As I kind of alluded to earlier, in July of this year, President Donald Trump's Department of Justice sent a letter to Texas political leaders demanding that the state dismantle congressional voting districts designed to empower communities of color to elect candidates of their choice. Trump also sought to flip 5 of the state's congressional districts from Democratic to Republican control. California Governor Gavin Newsom announced a plan to respond to Texas's attack on voting rights by redrawing the state's congressional map to flip 5 Republican districts to Democratic control in advance of the 2026 midterm elections. In August, the California legislature passed a legislative package that called for a November 4th, 2025 special election in which voters will be asked to adopt the new state congressional map that aims to achieve this goal. So if passed, Prop 50 would create new district boundaries that would be adopted for California's U.S. House representation. The new map, like I mentioned, would be in effect starting in the 2026 elections. Where does California Common Cause and where does Common Cause stand on Prop 50? California Common Cause is not opposing Prop 50. We decided to evaluate any mid-decade redistricting against our fairness criteria. Those criteria focus on proportionality, public participation, racial equity, time limits, and support for federal and independent redistricting reforms. And we determined that Prop 50 meets those standards, so we would not oppose. Digging into the fairness criteria that we developed a little bit. So, Common Cause's position follows decades of advocacy against partisan gerrymandering, including taking Common Cause v. Rucho to the U.S. Supreme Court, drafting provisions in the Freedom to Vote Act to ban partisan gerrymandering, and championing independent commissions nationwide. We oppose gerrymandering on principle, no matter who does it. However, we also recognize that this is a complicated and critical moment for our democracy, and voters have the right to make informed decisions about how their elections work. This is no longer one state game in the system. It's a national power grab designed to make Donald Trump unaccountable to voters in a midterm election he's afraid of. Our fairness criteria provide a framework to determine how we'll use our limited time and resources, given the many challenges to democracy our country is facing. If a mid-decade redraw meets the criteria, we will not oppose it. We evaluate maps according to, as I mentioned, proportionality, which means that any mid-decade redistricting responding to Trump's effort should be a targeted response proportional to the threat posed by mid-decade gerrymanders in other states. Public participation as a criterion. Any redistricting must include meaningful public participation, whether through a vote of the people or open public processes. Racial equity. Redistricting must not further racial discrimination or dilute the political voice of Black, Latino, Indigenous, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and other communities of color. Federal reform. Leaders pursuing mid-decade redistricting must publicly endorse the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, including provisions banning mid-decade redistricting and partisan gerrymandering. Endorsement of independent redistricting.
Mr. Vicuña, I'm just hearing from our interpreters. If you could just slow down a little bit, it'll make it easier for them to make sure we're capturing your words.
Sure, you got it. So another element of the fairness criteria is endorsement of independent redistricting. Leaders pursuing mid-decade redistricting must publicly endorse a neutral, fair redistricting system, such as citizen-led independent redistricting commissions as the long-term solution. And finally, a time limitation. Any new redistricting maps must expire following the 2030 census, which counts all people in our country, and be replaced through the regular decennial redistricting process. And in places with reform measures, those reform measures must be reinstated in the next redistricting cycle. President Trump is pressuring states like Texas to redraw maps mid-decade for raw partisan gain. It's not isolated, as I mentioned. It's a coordinated effort to silence dissent and manipulate the midterms before a single vote is cast. In addition to Texas, as I was describing, Missouri has already done a redraw. North Carolina has announced it will redraw an already gerrymandered map. Florida, Indiana, and Kansas are also considering special sessions to waste taxpayer dollars for a mid-decade redraw. So California's proposal passed our fairness criteria because it wasn't about entrenching one party. It was about protecting checks and balances in a moment of democratic crisis. As I described, there are other threats as well to voting rights that we're watching carefully. Louisiana, the Calais case, and the importance of protecting Section 2. This really isn't about lines on a map. It's about whether our government remains accountable to the people or becomes a tool of authoritarian control. Mid-decade redistricting done in bad faith undermines democracy by letting politicians choose their voters instead of voters choosing their politicians. When voters lose their voice, entire communities lose access to fair representation on healthcare, education, jobs, public safety, and many other crucial issues. This is a democracy stress test. Either voters remain the ultimate check on power, or politicians manipulate the rules to make themselves untouchable. We're fighting to make sure voters still have the final say. Thank you much. And apologies for going too fast earlier. Happy to cover anything that wasn't clear.
Well, here's a question I'm going to read just in the interest of time. Or Henrietta, if you can join us, you have a very good question. I'd like you to ask it.
Thanks so much, Sandy. So if the passage of Prop 50 would give California an additional seat in Congress, what happens to that seat when the redistricting maps go back to normal with the next census?
So the passage of Prop 50 would not impact the number of total seats that California has in the U.S. House. It would just impact likely partisan control of those seats. California, the number total would remain the same.
But I think the question is also what kind of guarantee do we have that come the 2030 census, we will go back to the independent commission as the drawer of maps post 2030 census? What guarantee do we have that that will happen?
That's written in the legal language in the package of legislation. That is a legal requirement that this is time limited until after the next census.
So in other words, if you vote for Prop 50, you're making sure that this will result in a legislative mandate that we will restore the redistricting commission in post 2030.
That's right. Yes.
And could the legislature claw that back?
Well, they would have to go again to the people, to a statewide vote, to try any attempt to disempower the commission beyond 2030. You'd need a new vote on that. Yeah, because under the current provisions as Prop 50 and associated legislation is written, this is time limited. After 2030, a new census, the California Redistricting Commission is empowered once again to take the reins and draw districts.
And one final question before we go to our third speaker comes from Nestor Fantini. I'll ask it in the interest of time. Does a constitutional amendment in California need a simple majority to pass?
Yes.
So thank you for taking us through the national view of where we're at and what specifics you've shared with us about Prop 50. Now we'll go to Brittany Stonecipher, who is the Voting Rights and Redistricting Program Manager for California Common Cause, and before that worked as a voting rights attorney with the ACLU. Ms. Stonecipher will detail what voters need to know about the November 4th special election. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sandy. And thank you everyone for being here. Again, I'm Brittany Stonecipher, and I'm the Senior Program Manager for Voting Rights and Redistricting for California Common Cause. I'm here to provide an overview of what voters need to know to make their voices heard on the November 4th special election. In particular, I'd like to focus on voter turnout disparities in California, which is why we do this work, how voters can register and cast a ballot this election, and Common Cause's nonpartisan election protection program and voter resources. So first, California is an incredibly diverse state, yet our voter turnout does not represent that. The California electorate is usually whiter, wealthier, and older than the actual population of California. According to US Census estimates, white people make up 41% of California's adult population, yet they comprise 55% of the state's likely voters. Latinos, on the other hand, represent 35% of the adult population, but account for only 21% of those most likely to vote. Asian Americans comprise 15% of the adult population, but only 14% of likely voters. In recent years, California has made significant improvements to voter access and turnout. However, our state still has a long way to go in addressing voter participation disparities.
Ms. Stonecipher, let me just remind you, speak slowly. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. During the 2024 general election, overall eligible voter turnout was 62%. However, for Latino voters, it was 46%, and for Asian American voters, it was 54%. These disparities have been persistent across elections. Adding to the urgency of this moment, turnout is often lowest during off-cycle and special elections, and turnout disparities are typically greater during these elections. That is why our election protection and voter engagement program is critical. It helps support all eligible voters so the electorate is reflective of the actual population. While in many ways, California is a leader in protecting the rights of voters, we still need to ensure that higher voter participation is representing everyone, especially voters of color. Being heard and fairly represented starts by showing up at the ballot box. That's why every election year, including this one, California Common Cause mobilizes and trains nonpartisan election protection volunteers to serve as the voters' first line of defense against obstacles to the ballot box and to ensure elections officials and poll workers are complying with the terms of state law. Our trained nonpartisan volunteers protect California voters against electioneering and intimidation, confusing rules, outdated infrastructure, misinformation, and needless obstacles to the ballot box. We encourage voters who need assistance to call or text 866 Our Vote, which I'll mention again at the end, 866 Our Vote. This hotline is available in multiple languages: English, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Bengali, Hindi, Urdu, and Tagalog. California Common Cause will have poll monitors in certain areas of Southern California, and we will be monitoring hotline calls and developments across the entire state. Voters can also find resources at commoncause.org/voteca. So just to go through some of the information that voters need in this election, in addition to conducting on-the-ground poll monitoring and statewide election protection, Common Cause will also be working to close voter disparities by ensuring that all Californians have accurate, easy to understand information about how to participate in this election. So let's go through some of the most important information that voters need. First, to vote in statewide elections in California, a person must be a US citizen, a resident of California, at least 18 years old on election day, and not currently serving a prison sentence or found mentally incompetent to vote. Although voters must be 18 or older on election day, in California, 16 and 17-year-olds can pre-register to vote. Most Californians with a criminal record have the right to vote, which is a common misconception that people are always prohibited from voting with a conviction. That is not true. The only time a conviction affects the right to vote in California is while an individual is serving a state or federal prison sentence. Californians who are unhoused and meet the eligibility criteria described before also have the right to vote. Voting registration is required before an eligible voter can cast a ballot in California. It's important to make sure that registration is up to date to receive a correct ballot in time for the election. If a person has moved, changed their name, or regained the right to vote since they last voted, they need to update their registration. Voters can also update language preferences when updating their voter registration, which can allow them to receive a ballot and other election materials in the language they feel most comfortable voting. For the November 4th special election, voters can register or update their registration online or by mail until Monday, October 25th. If voters miss that deadline, they can use same-day registration to register or update their registration in person at a vote center or polling place until the close of polls on election day. Finally, when it comes to voting, Californians have multiple ways to cast their ballot. The first option is by mail. All voters with active registration will automatically be mailed a ballot. This ballot can be returned through USPS in the ballot envelope provided. There's no postage required. Mailed ballots must be postmarked by November 4th, but we highly recommend mailing them no later than Halloween to ensure that they are received in time. Another way that voters can return their ballot is by returning them to an official ballot drop box anywhere across the state. In many counties, this is likely to be the fastest way to return a ballot that's received by mail. Finally, if preferred or needed, voting locations will be open in every county on November 4th from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., and voters can vote in person. There's also early in-person voting options available now, and more locations will open across the state starting October 25th. When voting in person, voters who need language access assistance can ask poll workers what materials they have available in their preferred language. Bilingual poll workers will have name tags identifying the languages they speak. If a voter's preferred language is not available in a particular voting location, poll workers can help the voter access the Secretary of State's hotline, which is staffed with bilingual poll workers covering 10 languages. Voters should also know that they do not have to show ID to vote in a state election in California. Although poll workers may ask for ID to make it easier to find the voter in the poll books, it is not mandatory to have one. Finally, for in-person voters, if you are in line when polls close at 8 p.m. on election day, you have the right to vote, and voters should stay in line. However voters choose to cast their ballot, we encourage them to sign up on the Secretary of State's website to track their ballot so they are notified when their ballot is received or counted. And again, if voters run into any questions or challenges on election day anywhere across the state, they can call 866-OUR-VOTE. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for that overview. So we have a couple of questions that I want to pick up before we go to all our speakers, open the conference up to all our speakers. And the one question that I think is very important from Tanae Gukele with India Currents. Tanae, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sandy. My question is that do we know which California districts are likely to be redrawn significantly, or will there be changes in all of them?
Dan, maybe that's, I don't know if you or Brittany want to respond to that.
Yeah, it's probably more one of the, either Brittany or Darius. Who know the kind of granular stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to hand that over to Brittany, who is our voting rights aficionado.
Great.
Can
Brittany,
you, can you repeat the question? Sorry, I was answering one in the chat.
sure. Just do we know which California districts will likely be redrawn significantly as a result of Prop 50 winning, or will there be changes in all of them?
That's a great question. So not all districts would be changed by Prop 50. However, the main areas that districts would be changing are around the LA and Inland Empire areas, around Sacramento, down through Lodi to San Joaquin, and somewhat around Fresno. There is a great interactive map on Cal Matters that shows the before and after, and that you can zoom in and see the differences in those districts.
Great. I think so many of our questions actually could be taken up by any of our three speakers. I'm going to just open the Q&A at this point. And Nestor, thank you for these excellent questions where you're really trying to place the importance of this special election in the wider context of changes going on, including with the crackdown on immigrants. Nestor, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you again, Sandy. So yeah, my question is connected with the incredible amount of fear that the Latino community is having nowadays. Given, of course, I mean the federal authorities' policies of intimidation against many immigrant communities, including citizens. So, do you think that of the 35% of Latinos that are eligible to vote, and you mentioned that actually only 25% actually vote, do you think that that's going to impact dramatically those numbers? And of course, I mean, this is directed to Brittany, but Dan and Darius, you're welcome to answer as well.
And thank you for that question. So yes, as I mentioned before, eligible Latino voters make up 35% of the overall eligible voter population, but they account for only 21% of those who typically vote in California elections. We are concerned that voter intimidation, whether it be from private actors or state actors or even potentially federal actors, could target Latino voters in particular, and could, with the goal of decreasing turnout and representation and making these representation gaps even wider. That's a big part of why Common Cause is doing the work that we're doing on an ongoing basis to improve policy and make voting rights more accessible in general, but also to get the information out that voters need. And again, to do on the ground poll monitoring to make sure that we're protecting voters. So we're going to have kind of 3 tiers of eyes and ears on the ground responding to issues on election day. We're going to have poll monitors in the field. We'll be monitoring hotline calls from across the state and communicating with our other partners across the state who are doing poll monitoring in other counties. And we're going to be communicating issues as needed up the ladder to the Secretary of State's office, the State Attorney General's office, and to some of our federal partners who are prepared to file litigation if, for instance, ICE or National Guard makes a presence at any polling places.
Thank you. We have a question from Nicole Chang. Nicole, do you want to ask your question? And if you're having issues, I can ask it for you. Even if, there you are, Nicole, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I thank you so much for giving me an opportunity. I have a few questions, but the most likely, like, even though proposition 50% pass, the lawsuit from the Republican Party is expecting, and what impact will give this kind of measure in California have on President Trump?
So you have two questions. You're asking about the possible impact of a Republican lawsuit, and you're asking a political question, which maybe our speakers may not feel they're in a position to respond to, but let's open it up and see, especially Mr. Kemp, what do you think the impact of a Republican Party lawsuit could be? I wasn't aware there was one that was threatened.
Generally speaking, the Republican Party has threatened to sue over Prop 50, either on this issue. So I don't want to get into the political impact of this. Once again, we're a nonpartisan organization, so I'm going to actually ask Dan to pop in here a bit to give a bit of kind of his thoughts on the impact on a more national scale.
Yeah, well, let me start with the legal piece. In 2019, Common Cause brought a challenge to North Carolina congressional districts to the Supreme Court, a case called Rucho v. Common Cause. We made an argument that partisan gerrymandering should be considered by the court a violation of the First and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The court, in a closely divided 5-4 decision, rejected our argument. They said partisan gerrymandering is non-justiciable. Federal courts can't come up with a way to determine when partisan gerrymandering goes too far such that it violates the Constitution. So unfortunately, we lost, and the people lost, really. And so it's hard to know in federal court what exactly a Republican challenge to California's move would make, considering the Supreme Court's awful precedent in the Rucho case. In terms of political impact on the president, I mean, he's the one who decided that there are no rules, that he is fearful of the wrath of the voters in the midterm election. So I suspect that whether California had done this or not, he would be going around the country chasing states in addition to Texas to further his aim of avoiding accountability in the midterm election. And we're seeing that play out in other places as well, like I mentioned.
So in our introduction, we said proposition that the special election around Prop 50 could determine the balance of power in Congress, but with the number of states now following the lead of Texas to flip districts to increase Republican representation, are you aware of states where Democrats have already a significant representation and are looking to flip Republican districts to increase it? And to what extent will the election November 4th really change the equation of the kind of balance of power in Congress when there are so many states vying to expand Republican, not so many vying to expand Democrat? Will California make the difference?
I think it's really difficult to know. I mean, sometimes midterm elections are wave elections. You see shifts of 40 seats, and maybe a handful here or there won't make a difference. 2022 was a surprisingly good election for the Democrats, despite being in power, and it wasn't as much of a wave. And if you have a smaller margin, it could make a difference. I think it's just very difficult to know. But I mean, from our perspective, the big problem with this gerrymandering war that the president launched is that in no state is the interest in fair representation for communities. It's entirely a partisan battle that the president launched to squeeze more seats out of Republican states. You generally already gerrymandered maps to somehow squeeze more out of those, and people get left behind. So that's to us the biggest problem with this entire gerrymandering wildfire.
Yeah. And can I just do a really quick add on here? Is that this is why we keep reiterating the point that it's important that voters pick their elected officials and politicians and not politicians picking their voters. This is what gerrymandering does at the end of the day. And so there's the process of gerrymandering is basically electioneering, right? They're trying to figure out how can we get enough of our people into certain districts, whether they be Republican or Democrat, right? How can they get their people into certain districts to sway certain votes? And I think that kind of thought process is harmful for our democracy broadly, and 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 it could end the other way. There's no guarantee that moving people into certain districts will guarantee you votes in certain ways. So I think that at the end of the day, it's very important that we keep moving forward the ball, which is making sure that voters at the end of the day select their district, have input in determining what their district lines look like for congressional and legislative seats in their states. That is the value of the work that Common Cause continues to do, which is try to make sure that voters are heard and power is held to account in our system, so that the interest of politicians isn't the driving force in our electorate. The interest of the people is the driving force in our electorate.
Well, on that note, I'd like to use our last few minutes with a question for all three speakers, which is ultimately you're saying, Mr. Kemp, what really counts is that people vote. The number of people who vote, the voter participation. And I think at the beginning of your presentation, Ms. Stonecipher, you've referred to the sort of level of participation in special elections always being a challenge. So what would each of you tell a prospective voter who's sort of on the fence? I don't know about voting this time around. Everything's getting very confusing. What difference will it make? Especially if the other states are already prepared to gerrymander in a way that my vote won't in the end make a difference. Let's start with Mr. Kemp, a soundbite, your pitch to the skeptical voter, the hesitant voter, the voter who sort of says, how can my vote make a difference?
That's a really great question, Sandy, and that's a really great. That's something we hear often, that I hear quite often from people who are really frustrated. At the core of that question is people are frustrated that their needs are not getting met, that they've done the right things, they've gone and voted before, or they're good tax-paying citizens, and yet every day cost of living gets more expensive. ICE raids are happening in communities. The National Guard gets called out for almost for no good reason. And so at the end of the day, I think people need to build more community. So my argument to them is actually your vote does matter, because if you build community, if you have family, if you have people you care about, just look at the interactions and the things that are happening in our society as a whole. And it's not to say that voting in a vacuum fixes all of that. Voting is one piece of our civic pie. Voting is a very important piece. And that also means going out and building community, engaging in organizations like ours, commoncause.org, to build community with other people who care about saving our democracy and getting money out of politics and making sure that politicians listen to the people at the end of the day. So those are the values at the end of the day I think people should care about and think about when they are considering whether or not to vote or not, which is how is this really going to impact your community? It may not impact you as an individual in some way, shape, or form, but how is it going to impact your community as a whole?
Thank you. And Mr. Vicuña, your pitch to the skeptical or hesitant or questioning or baffled voter.
Sure. Elected officials will not listen to you if you don't show up on election day and demonstrate that you will hold them accountable.
Great. Brittany Stonecipher, your pitch. And then I have two very important questions that came in under the wire before we all split.
Well, democracy works best when it's fair and inclusive, and that means turning out to vote so that other people aren't making your decisions for you. And even though our democracy is under threat and it's not perfect, it's an evolving experiment, and we all need to participate.
Those are all three good sound bites to end on, but I have two questions. One from Solomon Smith with California Black Media. In the interest of time, I'll ask the question. Do you see this sort of midterm redistricting process driven by a fierce partisan desire to block out the other party? Do you see this part of the process becoming normalized? And if so, is there any long-term solution for this?
Really, I'm going to give a really quick soundbite here, or a really quick thought process here on this, is that uh, our deputy director, Russia Chavez Cardenas, has made a really good point to me on several occasions that this current redistricting fight, everything that is going on, Prop 50, it's people are afraid of what our current administration is doing. When you have presidents that are abusing the system, that are once again sending National Guard members out for no apparent good reason into cities, making various threats and other inappropriate comments, right? People are just afraid of what our federal government could do at the end of the day. And so what we have to do, and what we're trying to do over at Common Cause broadly, is to make sure that people see that there is actually hope, right? If people live and operate in a state of constant fear, then there will be this constant back and forth and tete-a-tete. But it's more important that we try to build in hope and show that there are ways to actually fix our society and our democracy, that people are standing up and standing up together to do that, and that we are actually facing the concerns that people have at the end of the day and trying to make progress on those serious concerns that people have. So, a lot of what I see in our politics right now is that people are afraid of what other individuals with power are doing, and we all should be concerned about those things. But we also need to work hard and collectively join in together to fight systems that are not working for us as a whole. And so that's what's really important, is that we build in that hope by collective action and community engagement with each other on these issues.
Thank you so much. We have more questions, but we have run out of time. A very good question from Ling Huang, but I think we can't hold our speakers any longer. If you see Mr. Huang's question and are willing to respond in the chat, we'll leave it open for another 2 minutes. But I would say you've helped open the door to what we know and what we don't know and what we need to know about the November 4th election and about the larger question of representation as impacted by what's happening over the battle of the gerrymandering battle happening in so many other states across the country. So my thanks. Yesterday, we got word that Secretary of State Shirley Weber would like to do an in-person Q&A session with our media on the 21st. I'll be sending a note about that in the next 24 hours to everybody. But for me, this really, you often don't know what you don't know. And now I have a better idea of what I need to know. Thank you so much, Common Cause. Thank you to our interpreters, above all. Thank you all for the excellent questions in today's conference. Now our conference is closed.